hang out in the Discord. We're going to be in the Mount Washington channel, and if anyone has questions for the panelists as we go, please use the Q&A function so that the panelists and myself are able to see them and they don't get lost in the chat. So before I start interrogating everyone, why don't we go around the room and introduce ourselves? Can we start with Mary?
Hi, I'm Mary Fan. I'm a sci-fi fantasy author, mostly of books for young adults, based in Jersey City. My books include Stronger Than a Bronze Dragon, which is a steampunk fantasy, and the Starslip Trilogy, which is sci-fi. And I'm also the co-editor of the Brave New Girls anthologies about girls in STEM.
All right, Josh.
Hey, my name's Joshua Palmatier. I'm a fantasy author with DAW Books. You can get my first series, the entire series, all in one massive trade paperback. It's called The Throne of Amancore. And my most recent series begins with Shattering the Ley. The entire series is already out at this point. So this deals with ley lines in the world. And I'm hoping that all of those books have lots and lots of tension in them. I think that's why I'm on the panel. I'm also a founder of the Small Press Zombies Need Brains, and we release science fiction and fantasy themed anthologies. So I'll put links in the chat so you guys can go check that out at a later date if you want.
And then you go by Chelsea, you said?
Yes,
did I mishear that?
That is
yes.
my name.
Okay, yes, Chelsea.
Okay, hi, I'm Chelsea. The name you'll find on the cover of my books is C.L. Polk. Thought it would look good. I have so far published 4 fantasy novels. 3 of them are a trilogy. One of them is standalone, maybe? I don't know. We'll find out later. I've written a couple of short stories. And I guess I'm on the panel because one of the most common things I hear from people who have read my book is, I didn't get to sleep last night and I blame you.
That's a good problem to have. Well, yes, it's good to hear as an author, I think. All right, and last but not least, Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott Edelman, writer, editor, and podcaster. I just sold my 106th short story last month. A bunch of these are collected in various collections. The most recent one is called Things That Never Happened. A lot of tense stories in there. And before that, Tell Me Like You've Done Before has a bunch of stories that are written in homage to people I admire. So if you're upset that you can't get your hands on that John Steinbeck werewolf story, I've got a Mice and Men zombie story in this one. So you track down that one. As an editor, I edited Science Fiction Age magazine for 8 years, read about 10,000 stories a year for that in order to choose the half a dozen we published every other month. So that's a lot, looking for tension. And as a podcaster, I host the Eating the Fantastic podcast, 145 episodes live so far, in which I interview writers, editors, agents, and talk about how they do what they do while we're having a meal.
Excellent. All right, so I believe I was picked for moderating this panel because I'm editor at The Dread Machine, which publishes suspenseful and dreadful dark fiction. Mostly, I think it's been mostly like sci-fi and some horror stuff, and some dark fantasy as well. Now, to start us off, I wanted to ask a lowball or easy hanging fruit, whatever the colloquialism is. What is tension, and why do you think authors need to include it in their writing? Scott, would you like to go first?
Well, there are different kinds of tension. First, I should point out, one is just the tension that any story should have, which causes you to keep reading the story. There is sometimes what is going to happen next. I'm interested in finding out what happens next is tension. I think we're here more to talk about the other kind of tension, the kind Chelsea was talking about earlier about your books keep me up at night. But I find that with a really good story, I am always get the better a story is, the tenser I am, because I worry, will the writer stick that landing? Is the writer, will the ending come in, and will it give me what the story has promised? So there's always that level of tension. But the other aspect of tension that I think we're here to talk about is the one that makes us extremely nervous and worried on behalf of our characters. And we always want our readers to care about the people we write about. And if they truly care about them, they're going to be worried, will they get the ending I want them to have, rather than the ending an evil writer might want to give them for the plot requirements. So, so that's one of the things we do. I think if we can create tension in the writer, what we're doing is making them really care very much that our character will make it through the story and have a happy ending of sorts.
Anyone else want to tackle that? Josh, I see you're now self-describing as an evil writer.
Yeah, I think Scott pretty much nailed it, or at least talked about the ones that I had come up with for types of tension. I think the biggest one that I like to play with in my writing is that whole uncertainty with the writer, or sorry, with the reader. Like I want the reader to not know exactly what's going to happen, and that's the kind of tension I want in the reader to keep them reading. I want them to keep reading because they're like, okay, I have no idea where this is going, or I think I know where this is going, but maybe not, and that kind of tension. So I want that kind of tension in the reader. And then I have a little list of things that we can talk about how to force that on the reader in the writing itself, but I don't think you want to go quite that detailed just yet. So I'll let some people answer first.
I think there are, I mean, you guys are both right. There's multiple different types of tension, and we've talked a lot about plot tension. I think what's also important is emotional tension in the book. Like the last book I read in one sitting, like I sat down to read a chapter and didn't get up until I was done with the whole thing, was a rom-com, because I just got really, really invested in the characters. And I was like, oh my God, I love these characters so much. How is this all going to work out? And of course, it's a rom-com, so the physical stakes are pretty low, but the emotional stakes were really high.
There we go. I was not muted there. There. So Chelsea, would you like to add anything, or you want to go on to the next question?
I think everybody got it.
Monica, I
You're
think your
muted again,
microphone is
Emma.
muted.
No. It's the end of the con.
That will be the real tension of the panel.
Yeah, remembering which way my control switch is. Okay, so Chelsea, what are some strategies you use to introduce or maintain tension in your writing?
Well, I mean, I give the reader information. I just don't give them all the information. So what I do is I tell the reader something, and what I'm doing is I'm offering them a breadcrumb. So they pick it up and say, oh, but what does this mean? And I don't tell them. I just keep going and I give them another breadcrumb. So it's kind of a delicate balance, because if you're too coy or you're too obviously withholding information, the reader gets frustrated with you and they're impatient. They're like, quit messing me around and tell me what I want to know. But if you're too open, then there's nothing to hang the reader's imagination on. And it can almost feel like the story loses momentum. So you have to kind of figure out your nice, happy medium. So what I do is I give the reader a piece of information, but I do it in a way that means that there's a hook in it. So that I want them to ask, well, how is that possible? Or why is that happening? Most often, sometimes it's like, but who stole the muffins is like the other question. Like, and then as I'm going along, I will give them another piece of information that hints toward a certain conclusion, so they have something to chew on, think about, anticipate, form their own opinions on. And then I pay it off, but not completely, because I give them another piece of information that has another hook in it.
I like that strategy. Anyone else want to jump in on that one? What are some strategies you use for tension in your writing?
Well, Chelsea mentioned breadcrumbs, and I use a metaphor of a story as being a time-release capsule, and that you as a writer know everything. Even if you're a pantser, you eventually come to know everything as you improvise, and then you say, okay, now I know everything. And you have this decision, in what order do I reveal all this information that I know? and you could reveal the same information in the wrong order, and there's no tension because you've given things up. So often one of the things I have done is, if you let the reader become aware of something which will happen later in the story, that then makes them nervous about, okay, how is this going to happen later? And I'll just drop in the opening couple of sentences of the story that I wrote that came out last year in a horror anthology called Miscreations, and the story is titled Only Bruises Are Permanent. And the first 3 sentences are: after Amanda broke her lover's wrist, but before she broke his legs, after she threw him out of her apartment, but before she threw him out of her apartment window, she found herself in the tattoo parlor, not entirely sure how she'd gotten there. So basically what I have done is indicated a couple of incidents, that the incidents that have happened and the incidents that are going to happen, and here we are while she's wondering, gee, that something weird is just going on. And the hope is that the reader will want to find out, okay, why did she do the things that she did, and why is she going to do the things that she's going to do? I mean, I tried to accomplish a couple of different things in here, but basically, so the reader also knew that the person who was not treating her very well eventually gets his. But so sometimes one method is to give a piece of information that, well, that's not even foreshadowing, that's spilling exactly certain things are going to happen. But that's what, if we let the reader know something will happen, they will either wonder, uh-oh, how will that happen? Or, will the people I don't want to have harmed get harmed when that thing happens, or whatever. So that's one way of doing it, sort of a little peek ahead into the future.
Basically classic Columbo, right? Columbo shows always started by revealing who the murderer was, and then the whole show was, will Columbo, or how will Columbo end up figuring it out? So they created the tension that way.
And when I'm a plotter, unlike I think Scott, you're like a notorious pantser, I believe. But as a plotter,
you are correct.
One of the things I do, even before I start writing, is sort of like what Chelsea said, start planting breadcrumbs. But when I'm plotting a novel, especially, I try to end each chapter on a question, not a literal question like with a question mark, but with something that will leave the reader being like, huh, so what happens next? Like, maybe there's a reveal, and then the next chapter will be, what the consequences of that are, or maybe there's an introduction of a new character and the next chapter will be about that. So it's kind of leaving each little chapter on a bit of its own little cliffhanger, so that the reader will want to read the next chapter and see what happens.
So when writers are working on their stories, do you guys have ways that you decide how you're going to include that tension? Like, I know we talked about the breadcrumbs and the time capsule, like those analogies or metaphors. So how do you think writers should decide the best ways to include tension in their story?
I think it kind of comes down to what the stakes of your story are. Like if you're writing something with a lot of physical stakes, kind of end of the world or, physical danger types of things, you might use one method versus if you're writing, something that's more of a character-driven story, where the stakes might actually be more, emotional, more about, what's going to happen to the people and their relationships.
I'd agree with Mary that it's how you include your tension totally depends on what type of story you're trying to write. The tension in a mystery is going to be a lot different than, the tension in an epic fantasy, unless it's a epic fantasy mystery. But but yeah, you kind of gotta decide what kind of tension are you going for. Is it going to be like a mystery tension where it's like who killed who and how are you going to figure that out, or how are the detectives going to figure that out? Or is it something more like an epic fantasy? The tension tends to be more, I need to get this done, but then I have all of these obstacles in my way. So how are you going to get past all of these obstacles to get to your ultimate goal? So there the tension is more, okay, we finally defeated the dragon, now we got to go to, so the tension is a little bit more physical there. But in the end, I think almost all of the tension comes down to the stakes. like Mary said, you got to figure out what the stakes are for the character, what the stakes are for the world, and you got to figure out how you're going to heighten those stakes. Like obstacles is one way. You know, if we don't get there by such and such a time, then you know everything's going to fall apart. And then the obstacles are creating tension because you're draining away the time. But all of it comes down, I think, to creating that uncertainty in the reader. You basically want to stress your reader out a little bit, because you want them to be uncertain. Are they going to make it on time? Is this character going to survive? You know, all of that all of the tension is coming from introducing uncertainty about whether things are going to work out in the end, even though almost all writers go into a book assuming that, you know, things will work out, quote unquote, in the end. They don't generally like the ones where everything goes bad. But yeah, I am a pantser, so I don't sit down and methodically like plot out exactly where I'm going to insert, you know, that hook like Mary Fan was saying at the end of each chapter or anything like that. I don't plot it out, but that's how I end up writing. That's how the structure ends up happening. Is I have something happen in the chapter, something gets resolved, but then like Mary Fan said, at the end, you've got to include some kind of hook that makes them want to go into the next chapter. And usually it's, we got past this obstacle, now we have this other obstacle, and how are we going to get past that? And that's the hook at the end of the chapter.
And I just want to add that in the writing process, this is where having a critique partner or a beta reader can be really helpful, because I have found just from participating in critique groups, sometimes what the writer thinks is the stakes or the source of tension isn't what the reader thinks. An example is this one book I critiqued recently where it was kind of a secret history type of novel. And the writer clearly thought the tension came out of, oh my God, what is this secret history? Meanwhile, the main character is being, you know, chased by all these bad guys. And us as readers were just like, you know, you've written more of a thriller. Like, we're more interested in knowing, you know, how she's going to survive, you know, these bad guys than in all these reveals. So the reveals are important, but you're like making those your climaxes instead of your sort of more physical stakes. So I just thought that was interesting, because she thought it's like, oh, you're going to be like, oh my God, when the secret history was revealed. And we're like, no, I mean, that was cool, but we really just want to know, like, is she going to survive to see the next day?
Yeah, to my mind, the thing that is singular in having the tension is character. Because if you don't have a character that you worry and fret and care about, and your heart breaks for that character, you are not going to be wondering what happened next. It sort of comes back to those first two different types of tension I mentioned. This is just the story tension that any story has. And yes, that kind of story where all you care about is, oh, how does this puzzle come to be? Yeah, you can have characters who are a little more cookie cutter or whatever there, I guess. But, you know, in order to really worry about them, you have to make them come alive, so that even when the stakes are lesser, as Mary mentioned earlier, when you read a rom-com and it's you know, are these people going to get together, or is there somebody going to get a date, or you know, whatever the thing happens to be, those can be intensely worrying if it's someone that you dread that something bad will happen to you, and you feel for them as much as you feel for yourself. So to my mind, for that true existential tension, I want to make sure that the reader really feels for this character. Yeah, and yes, I've read plenty. Like, I can remember a novel. I think I have expunged the name of the novel from my head. It came out about 10 years ago. It was a bunch of yuppies in the jungle, and vines come and try and eat everybody and drag them off in the jungle. You may remember. I think it was someone who's the second novel by someone who wrote a romantic thriller or something. And I said, The Ruins, yes, someone popped up with the name Ruin. And I read that novel and I said, I want them all to get eaten. So I had no tension, meaning I didn't care if anyone got killed. I kept reading because okay, how's this going to play out? I did finish the book, but there was for me personally, there was no tension because I didn't care about the characters. If you had taken a different character in the same situation, I would have been hanging on it because I said, no, not that one, please let that one live. And that comes down to character.
Chelsea, do you have any thoughts about ways writers the best ways for
Um,
writers to include it?
A lot of this stuff that's already been said was stuff that I like wrote notes about, but there's a technique that I actually want to share with you that might come in handy. This is something that I use to like not escalate tension right away, but to escalate tension partway through. I find it comes in very handy during like the middle part of a novel where everybody's like, okay, what do I do now? And that's that at the beginning, I let the character be wrong about what's happening. So I have a character and she's like cruising along and she is a witch and she can basically do magic to grant people's wishes. And somebody comes up to her and says, I want this thing. And she gets like this bad feeling and she's like, but I can't actually refuse to do it. It's not the witch way. I have to make the cost of doing it so unappealing that she'll just go away. So she names a huge price that like nobody would ever like really want to pay. But she's wrong. The person's like, okay, I'll be right back with this thing you just asked for me. Now give me my elephant. I'm like, oh, now what are you gonna do? And you can just keep doing this. You can just like let your character be wrong. Let your character like one of my biggest struggles is that I tend to write characters who are thoughtful and will like think a problem through from all angles in order to come up with the perfect decision. And what I need to do is I need to let them do that. But what I need to do is to make sure that all of that thinking and planning goes completely out the window because they were wrong about what was actually going on.
I like that strategy. I really do. That's a really good tip. Thank you.
Can I?
Go ahead. Yeah,
add
jump in.
Yeah, I was gonna say, one of the things that I don't think a lot of people think about when they're trying to create tension is a lot of times tension just comes down to your word choice and your sentence structure. Because I wrote this unpublished novel called Fever, and my critique group basically said that they felt like they were so stressed out after reading like the first 3 chapters and because of the word choice and the sentence structure I was using, and nothing had happened. I mean, one of the questions in the Q&A is, can you have tension without trauma? And yes, the answer is yes, because nothing had happened in this book. This doctor had arrived at this town. He'd met, you know, the people he was going to work with at the little hospital, small town hospital. And that's all that had happened in the first 3 chapters. And all the beta readers were like, I'm like so stressed out because I feel like something's going to happen. But I hadn't hinted at anything happening. You know, it was just all my word choice and the sentence structure and the way that I had created the atmosphere that everybody was on edge already. And I'm just like, he just came to town. Like, why are you so stressed out already? And
because they know you.
Well, yes, they probably do know me a little bit. but yeah, you can totally have tension without any kind of trauma or without any heavy duty action or anything along those lines. You just gotta choose the right words and create the right pacing with the sentence structure and stuff.
So how do you balance tension when you're writing a story and you've got multiple plot points or like parallel side-by-side plots happening at the same time? How do you manage that? Because I imagine it's pretty easy to focus on one and maybe forget to focus on the others or the subplots. And at the very end, you're like, oh crap, I needed to like be thinking about these things while I was writing to wrap it up nicely in the ending.
Well, sometimes when you turn away from the tension, that makes the tension even more. And sometimes that's why that other scene is in there. You have this extremely tense thread happening, and then you leave the thread for something else. And well, sometimes you could upset the reader there. No, go back to those other people who are in trouble right now. But often too much tension can be too much that the reader will get overwhelmed by it. So you're giving them a moment to take a breath, But the other aspect has to be just as important to the main point of the story as anything else. It can't just be extraneous filler. But often that's what it does. That they're still worrying about the people they're not with. That's what you hope. Even when they're not with the characters that you're creating attention for, they're still worrying about the B story that's happening at the same time. So when they get back to it, they're really rushed to it. So that's often what the purpose of the other one is, unless you have two things that are equally tense, two different people fighting to get to a place at the same time because they both have keys and they both have to turn the keys at the same time in order to shut the bomb. And they're operating independently. So then you can have two with equal amounts of tension. There's some stories that are set up like that, but it can either be equal tension or one is a slight relief from the tension.
So for me, as I said before, I'm a plotter. And when I plot and I have multiple storylines, I like to try to line up the climaxes so that, a climax for one storyline happens around the same time, like in the book, as the climax for another one. So that it's like, all right, we're building on two separate timelines or two separate points of view perhaps, but then here's one little climax so that it just kind of all happens simultaneously. So the whole thing feels more unified as a book. And if we're all, familiar with the classic, rising action, climax, denouement thing, just trying to have all these things sort of happen around the same time.
From the epic fantasy perspective, usually you have 3, 4, 5 different plot lines going on all at the same time throughout the trilogy or however long your series is. So it usually comes down to knowing when to sort of skip. So you want to bring, like Scott was saying, you want to bring one of the character plot lines up to a point where usually something has been resolved, because you want the reader to feel like satisfied that the story has moved along. But you also want to skip away to some other plot line when they've run up against whatever the next problem is. So it's like you're leaving the reader with that, holy crap, how are they going to solve this new problem? And so you leave the reader wondering that, and then you skip away to one of the other plot lines. And in one sense, you're doing what Scott was saying. You're kind of giving that the reader that sense of anticipation that I want to get back to that plot line and see what they do. But at the same time, you're also giving the reader a break and giving them a chance to think, like, what can they do, and give the reader a chance to kind of figure out what they think is going to happen instead of going right into it. And then when they get back there, they're part of the tension is, oh, I think they're going to do this. Is that what happens? But like Scott said, you can push the tension too high, and when you have multiple storylines like this, that's a really good way to sort of temper the tension a little bit and say, okay, I brought you up to this, but now we're going to skip away and give you a chance to breathe and catch your breath. But once you skip away, like Scott said, you don't want it to be a commercial break. You skip away with some other character, and then you use their plot line and get them up to, that breaking point on the tension before you skip back or skip to a third character or something like that. That's where the scene breaks and the chapter endings are all important in the book.
Anyone else want to tackle that one? No?
No, I want to add something to
Oh, go
that.
ahead.
I'm a short story writer, not a novelist, so I really don't have space for threads that way, but there's an additional thing I've done, which I guess you could say is similar to a thread, in that I have had stories where, let's say, you have 4 different scenes with different characters in them. That's a different kind of tension, because you've said, okay, we've had this scene with characters A and B interacting, and then we have the next scene with a different character. And so the reader will be thinking, why are we with these people all of a sudden? What does it mean? Why have we shifted over? That's a different kind of puzzle tension. Now, if you fail in telling the story by the end, eventually the writer will, if you're telling a mosaic story and you move through different people from different points of view, the reader's tension will be, what what does everything that's happening in this other place far away from the first scene have to do with that first scene? So that's a different kind of tension. Hopefully you successfully solve and explain to them in the end what that all means in telling a mosaic kind of short story. But that is still yet another kind of tension, which is the tension between the reader following along with the writer, and will this all come to make sense, or will they fail at the end, and how long can you juggle the plates in the air? So that is a different kind. That's a tension we feel with the juggler. Are they going to drop all those balls, or are they going to successfully be caught and spun around again? So that's what I've done occasionally, a different method of that threaded thing.
So are there examples of, or have you guys had experiences where you've accidentally tried to put in too much tension? Or do you like have descriptions of what like too much tension might look like for a reader?
I think if you have a problem and the problem is too much tension, my first assumption is going to be that you're being stingy with payoffs. Yes, you want the reader to be like holding a bunch of different kind of like questions in their mind as they're reading. But you want to pay off their curiosity. It's important to do this, because if you just keep piling on more and more and more suspenseful, high stakes, important things, readers are going to be exhausted. They're going to be confused. They're not going to be able to keep all these threads straight. And it's going to feel like, the very first piece of tension that you introduced has been forgotten about completely because we haven't heard back about this thing. So you have to give tension and you have to pay off tension, because what you're doing when you pay off tension is you're satisfying the reader. You're allowing them to engage further into the story. You're teaching them how to anticipate what's going on so they can be like, ha, I was right, or oh, who could have predicted this incredible plot twist? But when you're paying off tension, what you're doing is you're building trust between you and the person reading your book. So when you introduce them to something wild, they'll be like, I don't know. Say, oh, but you haven't done me dirty yet, so I'm gonna go with this.
I think sometimes writers confuse tension with twists, because I have read and seen things where there's just far too many twists for the sake of twists, where the writer is trying so hard to be clever, so hard to be unexpected, that it ends up not really making much sense in the context of a book. Because a good twist is one that you don't see coming, but once you see it, makes perfect sense. And there's a lot out there where it's like, well, I didn't see that coming, but it also doesn't make sense, and I don't like it. And oh my God, you just threw another one at me, and now nothing makes sense, and I really don't like it. One example from the film world is that horrible, horrible third Pirates of the Caribbean movie, where it just felt like they had run out of ideas, and we're just going to have everyone betray everyone and like twist, 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 twist. You're just going to watch anyway because it's a big budget movie. And I was like, none of this makes sense anymore. I don't like it.
Yeah, the whole concept of it. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, when it comes to TV, one of the things that bothers me the most is when I'm watching TV where the season is basically one long story, or the series is one long story, and they have spent episode upon episode setting this thing up, putting in their clues. The fans are like, this is going to happen, and somebody in the writer's room goes, oh, they guessed it, we have to change it now. It's like, oh, please don't do that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think a twist is the opposite of tension, because if there's something you didn't see coming out of nowhere, then you're not feeling tense, you're not worrying about it. I mean, the thing that the tension comes from worrying about something that is going to happen, that you fear might happen, that you're so connected with the plot that it's going to happen. So, I mean, well, I'm thinking of that in Alfred Hitchcock, there's that famous scene where there's a bomb under the table and the characters do not know that there's a bomb under the table. If the characters knew that there was a bomb under the table and trying to do something about it, you might not be as tense as you would be if the characters did not see the bomb. And you're going, there's a bomb under the table, don't you know this, do something about it. And they're just having coffee and tea or whatever and going about their business. And so I guess that's another way of tension. If you know something that the character has not yet figure it out, not through stupidity. If you sit around and say, well, the character is too stupid and that's why they don't know this thing, then you lose the connection. It's got to be there's some piece of information that you somehow have, which was easier in that movie setting, but that's an additional way for it to happen. That's why I think you can't do the twist. You've got to be, I fear the future for this character with just enough information to have me worry. And going back to what Joshua said, answer the question about, does it have to be trauma? Often what there just is, there's never trauma in that particular instance, but there's fear of trauma. You're worried is something going to happen. So you can have a story where you fear trauma the whole time and trauma never comes, but you're just on edge waiting for it to happen.
I do want to jump in briefly to chime in on this, because as I'm acquiring editor for the Dread Machine, we get a lot of stories, and some of them are horror genre, some of them are sci-fi genre, some of them are it's just they're in the middle somewhere for any genre. And one of the things that we see a lot, a common thing that ends up getting stories rejected, is writers having the characters suddenly wake up in a room with no context for how they got there after the story is already halfway through. It's like the character got knocked out and then they're just in this room because I wanted to put them somewhere to have something happen with the story, and then this other thing happened. And when we're going through and we're editing, it's sometimes we do accept these stories and do structural edits with the authors, and we go to them and we're like, look, your story is great until you have this room section, and then there's this other section that makes no sense, and then you have an awesome ending. So we can just cut this whole chunk of just meandering to make your story tighter and more suspenseful. And then one of the other things that we see in particular with horror is people seem to equate trauma with horror or with tension, just because there's a traumatic event does not it's more what you're doing as a writer. If you're throwing in a traumatic event, you are throwing in shock as a shock value, but that's not the same as tension in writing. And if you're going to include trauma in your writing, there needs to be a good justification for why it's there, because you don't want to re-traumatize your readers, and you want to have some aspects of foreshadowing. Okay, sorry, that's the end of my little soapbox there. We have several questions in the Q&A related to genre. Sorry, did you want to jump in, Josh?
Well, I was going to say, and it kind of answers one of the questions in the Q&A, where they ask us on thoughts on horror. Since you brought up horror, a lot of people, like you said, a lot of people think horror is, slash and blood and gore and all that kind of stuff. And I really don't think that's what horror is all about. I think the tension in horror is all psychological. So what you have to tap into for horror is the psychology of the reader. You're trying to get into the reader's head, and you're trying to make them scared of something, and that something, sometimes that something is, getting chopped up or whatever. But the key to the tension isn't the actual physical danger, it's the psychological aspects of that danger. And that's what you have to tap into for horror to, in my opinion, for horror to be horrifying. Just think about Silence of the Lambs. I mean, they didn't really focus on what he was doing in Silence of the Lambs. They focused on the psychological aspects of what he was doing and how it was affecting Clarice and all that kind of stuff. So for horror, I think the tension is all psychological. And yes, you might have blood and guts and all that kind of stuff along the way. But even a movie like Saw, the whole premise of the Saw for that first one is this idea that they have a way to get out, but the way they get out is just psychologically scarring. So, and that was the premise of the movie, and that's why that movie works.
Thank you. I have marked that one answered. Okay, so another genre question we have is, what about tension in a humorous story? And then also tension in stories that fall between genre definitions or aren't necessarily what we would call speculative fiction. I guess like how does tension fit into those? We talked a little bit about the romantic comedy, I think, with the characters.
Yeah, I think even if it's not, a romantic comedy, if it's any comedy, you're going to want to care about the characters and what happens to them. And, there's a lot of, stakes that might seem kind of low key, compared to speculative fiction or thriller stakes where it's like, oh, am I going to get a job or not? Or, oh, is my best friend going to forgive me for, saying this thing that was completely out of line or something like that. And those things can be sources of tension if you care enough about the characters. So it's just really important to get characters that are not necessarily always likable, but at least interesting so that you get invested in them.
As soon as I heard like tension for like a story that isn't necessarily genre, I immediately thought of this novel that I read by Vikram Seth called An Equal Music. And it's about a professional violinist. And like, okay, so there are a bunch of other details, but what I want to talk about is this. The main character plays a violin of excellent quality that has been on loan to him for years and years and years by this nice lady who actually owns the violin. He's basically been using it for a couple of decades. And Vikram Seth basically talks about this violin and where it comes from and how important it is to Michael. And you don't really think too much of it as you're reading it. It's like, oh, this is information that is interesting. And then he drops in that the woman whose violin it is not in very good health. And you're like, oh. And then a little bit later, he talks about how the woman who owns the violin, who is not in very good health, has a nephew who has come to take care of her. And you're like, oh. And he never actually says the nephew is there to vulture all of her money. But you start to get like extremely upset about the fate of Michael's borrowed violin. Like, is he still gonna have it? Like, honestly, that kept me reading for hundreds of pages.
Yeah, in terms of non-genre tension, I'm thinking of a movie I watched a few months ago called Moxie. It's on Netflix. I don't know if any of you watched that, but I watched it because it's about a teenage girl who starts a underground newspaper. Her mother used to do feminist zines when she was a kid, and I was fascinated by the idea since I did an underground newspaper in high school and almost got us kicked out. But it was a great movie, and hey, I got to know about the Linda Lindas before they went viral last week because they were in there. I loved them in that movie several months ago. But anyway, the tension in that is your hope, will this teenager find justice? Will there be justice for the school? Will she topple the misogyny in the school and burst through? What will happen to all these characters? So there was a tension in that, even though it was not are they saving the universe or anything like that. It was, you cared about the characters, you cared about the problem was set up for them. Will justice be done? And what will the relationship with her mother be? And things like that. So it was a fun, wonderful movie with tension and joy in it at the same time.
I think you make a really good point about story justice, because I think that can apply to any genre. Just this idea of, okay, the character that you care about is seeking some kind of justice for themselves, whether it's something really high stakes like life or death, or even low stakes like, will my article get published or something like that. And story justice, when it's paid off well, is a very satisfying ending. When it's not, it can leave the reader kind of cold, or the viewer, or whatever. And so I guess it's important to just know, what the story justice is in your case, and if you're going to pay it off or not, and if not, why not?
That's a good point. Okay, we're running towards the end of time. We only have about 5 minutes left. One last question from the Q&A. I wanted to address, is positive emotional tension as effective as desperate or fearful tension? And I guess my question would be, do you see those as different or separate types of tension?
I don't see them as different. I mean, am I gonna die is pretty tense, but are they gonna kiss is pretty tense too.
That's what I was gonna say based on the last discussion, is that, you know, in different genres it's just different stakes. You know, you're getting the, as Chelsea just pointed out, you know, the stakes in a romantic comedy are like, are they gonna get together? That's what you're tense about. And, you know, that's pretty positive emotional thing to be worried about. You know, are they gonna kiss? Are they gonna get together? You know, all that kind of stuff. So and humorous story is the same idea. You know, it usually in a humorous story the stakes aren't, you know, life or death or anything like that. It's a little bit more a little bit less traumatic than that. And so yeah, the positive emotional tension, I don't think of it as any different than, you know, the life or death kind of traumatic emotional tension. It's all really the same, and you're all using kind of the same techniques to get it across.
Yeah, and though they have different flavors, the rooting for something positive and hoping that something positive will happen, and the fearing that something negative might happen and you don't want it to happen, what they share is once the tension is released, that character's life has changed forever, either in a good way or bad way. So that's where the similarity is. At that moment of the release of tension and you let go, everything is different forevermore. So they are similar in that way.
All right, so let's go around in the room and do outros. And I would ask that you tell people where they can find you, and then if you happen to have, like, I know some works have already been discussed, but if there's a piece, like a short story or a movie or a book that you recommend, that's an excellent example of tension that's well done. Please feel free to share that. I can be found on Twitter at molo_rights and also at thedreadmachine.com. And I'll be hanging around a little bit in the Discord after this in case anyone has questions for me. So Mary, let's start with you.
Hi, I can be found online at maryfan.com and on Twitter and Instagram at astralcult. I'm sticking that in the chat. Thanks for coming out.
Well, and I'm ScottEdelman.com or at Scott Edelman on Twitter or eatingthefantastic.com as well, or search for Eating the Fantastic on Apple Podcasts. And we were supposed to mention some work we liked that was really tense by someone else. Okay, the thing I read most recently that I found the tensest, that I spent the time, I would actually like cover the page because I didn't want to accidentally peripherally see what was happening. I was reading Meg Eillison, who's up for the Nebula and the Hugo this year, had a trilogy, which was the Book of the Unnamed Midwife, which had then the Book of Ella and the Book of Flora. And I was so worried about those characters that something bad would happen in this post-apocalyptic world that I thought it's impossible that they're going to get through this without something happening around the corner, that like I was tense every page waiting for these horrible things to happen. Sometimes they might, sometimes they didn't, but I think that was the tensest thing I've read in a long time.
For me, you can find me at joshuapalmatier.com. You can find my small press Zombies Need Brains at zombiesneedbrains.com. I'm on Facebook and Twitter. Just search Joshua Palmatier or Zombies Need Brains. They should pop up pretty easily there. And we also have a Patreon page. You can check us out on Patreon and maybe help support the small press if you want there. The example that I had for a book that like created tons and tons of tension was actually a Stephen R. Donaldson book. He had a gap cycle a while ago, and the 5th book in that series like blew my mind as a reader and as a writer, because the entire book, it's like 550 pages long or something like that, but the entire book takes place within 24 hours, and the entire book I was like on the edge of my seat, couldn't put the book down, and it was just insane how he created the tension and the pacing in that, considering it was only a 24-hour time span. So I would recommend that 5th book in the Gap series.
Okay, it's my turn, right? Great. So you can find me at clpolk.com, and if you like Twitter, I'm there too. I just put links in the chat. I think if I was going to talk about a book that I read that I really enjoyed the tension on, I have to talk about Ninth House by Lee Bardugo. She pulls a lot of my favorite tricks for this. It's kind of an urban fantasy. It's set in Yale, and there's like this interesting secret magical hidden history of Yale kind of thing going on with the protagonist with a mysterious past, and it opens near the end of the story, so you don't know what's going on, so you have to go back and find out, and it's a mystery. And yeah, and then there's like stuff with like alternating timelines and alternating POV, and the whole thing just kind of served to basically make it so that I was like, I don't need to cook or do laundry or wash dishes or write my own book. What are you talking about? I'm reading this one.
Mary, did you have a recommendation you want to toss into the ring before we close out?
Yes, I completely forgot to do that, but I just
No,
wanted
that's
to
okay.
know that the rom-com I mentioned that I read all in one sitting is more than just a pretty face.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for being excellent panelists. I really enjoyed this discussion. I hope the audience did too. And if anyone has time, the Discord channel for this panel's after discussion is the Mount Washington room. All right. So that's it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great panel.
Thank you.
Thanks for moderating, Monica.
You're welcome. All right. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.